Kentucky trivia continued. Arriving in 1673, who was probably the first Englishman on Kentucky soil? 1673, who was the first Englishman on Kentucky soil? Gabriel Arthur. The Bank of Kentucky was organized in 1806 with what amount of authorized capital? The Bank of Kentucky was organized in 1806 with what amount of authorized capital? $1 million. Where did the first black high school in the state open on October 7th, 1873? Where did the first black high school in the state open on October 7th, 1873? Louisville. What Louisa native became Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1946? Fred Vinson. How many pounds of gunpowder did George Rogers Clark secure from the government officials of Virginia in 1776 for the protection of the Kentucky region? 500. In what year was Kentucky's second constitution adopted? What year was Kentucky's second constitution adopted? 1799. Who was twice brought to trial in the federal court of the District of Kentucky on treason charges in the early 1800s? Aaron Burr. What Kentuckian was a candidate for U.S. President in 1824? Henry Clay. Under Kentucky's first constitution, suffrage was limited to what group of citizens? White males aged 21 and over. In what year was Kentucky's first telephone exchange put into service? What year was Kentucky's first telephone exchange put into service? In Louisville. 1879. So the first black high school in the state opened October 7th, 1873 in Louisville. That's where the first black high school was at, in Louisville. Also, Kentucky's first telephone exchange that was put into service was in Louisville, too. How old was John Crepes Wickliffe Beckham when he was sworn in as the governor of Kentucky on February 3rd, 1900? So it's J.C.W. Beckham. How old was J.C.W. Beckham when he was sworn in as the governor of Kentucky on February 3rd, 1900, which is after William Justice Goebel, the German, was shot or assassinated. John Crepes Wickliffe Beckham was 31 years old. So he was the youngest governor at the time. 31 years old and he was governor. In 1922, what Louisville radio station became the first commercial station in the state? In 1922, what Louisville radio station became the first commercial station in the state? WHAS. WHAS. In 1852, what Kentuckian presented a bill to Congress requesting that George Washington's birthday be made a national holiday? In 1852, what Kentuckian presented a bill to Congress requesting that George Washington's birthday be made a national holiday? John J. Crittenden. What state law passed in 1908 helped establish rights for children? What state law passed in 1908 helped establish rights for children? The child labor law. In August 1867, who was elected state superintendent of public schools in Kentucky? In August 1867, who was elected the state superintendent of public schools in Kentucky? It was Zachariah F. Smith. How many churches were there in Kentucky when statehood was granted? How many churches were in Kentucky when statehood in 1792 was granted? There were 42 churches with 3,095 members. On what date did the Louisville-Nashville Railroad inaugurate its first rail service? On what date did the Louisville-Nashville Railroad inaugurate its first rail service? The L&N Railroad started out November 1st, 1859. That's when its first rail service went out, 1859, 2 years before the Civil War. Approximately how many Kentuckians over the age of 20 were unable to read in 1840? 42,000. In 1928, what property was purchased by Louisville for a commercial airport? In 1928, what property was purchased by Louisville for a commercial airport? Bowman Field. During the formation of the Missouri Compromise, what Kentuckian became known as the Great Compromiser and the Great Pacificator? During the formation of the Missouri Compromise, what Kentuckian became known as the Great Compromiser and the Great Pacificator? It's Henry Clay. On December 13th, 1983, who was sworn in as Kentucky's first woman governor? On December 13th, 1983, a year after I was born, who was sworn in as Kentucky's first woman governor? Martha Lane Collins. What Henderson school teacher started observing Mother's Day in 1887? What Henderson school teacher started observing Mother's Day in 1887? Mary Towle Sasson Wilson. Mary Towle Sasson Wilson. So Henderson school teacher, she's the first one to recognize Mother's Day in 1887. Mary Towle Sasson Wilson. Mother's Day. Who is the founder and promoter of Kentucky Fried Chicken? Colonel Harlan Sanders. What Georgetown resident in 1789 fermented and distilled a mixture of corn, rye, and barley malt to produce the state's first bourbon whiskey? So it's corn, rye, and barley. Georgetown resident in 1789, his name was Reverend Elijah Craig. What former member of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate and governor of Kentucky had two sons, both generals fighting in opposing forces at the Battle of Shiloh? John J. Crittenden was a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, and he was the governor of Kentucky, and he had two sons, both were generals fighting in the opposing forces at the Battle of Shiloh. John J. Crittenden. Who was the governor of Kentucky during the Great Depression of the 1930s? Ruby Laffoon. Ruby Laffoon was the governor of Kentucky during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Laffoon the buffoon. Ruby the fucking QZs. So what was the voting age lowered in Kentucky in 1955? What was the voting age lowered in Kentucky in 1955? 18. What Democratic candidate for governor was shot by an assassin on January 30th, 1900? What Democratic candidate for governor, the first New Dealer of Kentucky, against the railroad monopolies and against the Confederate stranglehold that Kentucky has, was shot by an assassin on January 30th, 1900? William Justice Goebel. In what year was Louisville incorporated as a city? 1828. So, been here almost 200 years. 200 years coming up. Today's the 12th. 2012, so 2028 will be 16 years from now. 16 years, Louisville will have its 200-year anniversary in 16 years. In 1972, the state legislature passed its first tax on the production of what commodity? In 1972, the state legislature of Kentucky passed its first tax on the production of what commodity? Coal. In what year did the Kentucky Turnpike between Louisville and Elizabethtown open? 1956. Dan Carter Beard, who spent his childhood in Covington, founded what organization for boys in the United States? The Boy Scouts of America. What Frankfort resident was the first United States senator from Kentucky? John Brown. What religious seminary moved to Louisville in 1877 from Greenville, South Carolina? Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Who is the only Know-Nothing Party candidate to be elected as governor of Kentucky? Charles S. Moorhead. Charles S. Moorhead was a fucking know-nothing. The know-nothings are fucking fuck the know-nothings, okay? They're the fucking racists. They're the nativists, the WASP who was attacking Irish and the Germans, and they were, you know, of course, racist against anybody else. If they're attacking the Irish and Germans, they're gonna hate browns and blacks and everyone else too. It was the know-nothing party. They were scared they were losing their whole country because of all the Irish and German immigrants that were coming in. Know-nothings are the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. On what date was Kentucky's first newspaper printed? Or a year, if you can get the year. August 11th, 1787. In 1853, what Louisville resident became the first black to publish a novel in the United States? 1853, what Louisville resident? William Wells was the first black person to publish a novel in the U.S. William Wells was the first black man to publish a novel in the U.S. The Kentucky Renaissance Festival is held in what community? Kentucky Renaissance Festival is held in what community? Shelbyville. In 1962, what two writers collaborated to produce Kentucky Yesterday and Today? Ruby Dell Balher and Sarah Hendricks Claypool. What's the only resident professional theater between Louisville and Memphis? What's the only resident professional theater between Louisville and Memphis? Horse Cave Theater. Mob of Southern sympathizers destroyed the office and equipment of what Newport newspaper in 1856? True South. That's the name of the newspaper. What Kentuckian is said to have been the inspiration for the character of Little Eva in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin? Nancy Kennedy Letcher. Nancy Kennedy Letcher. What was the title of Kentucky-born Muhammad Ali's 1975 autobiography? The Greatest, My Own Story. What 1818 Bardstown resident was the inspiration for Stephen Foster's My Old Kentucky Home? It was the Federal Hill Manor. The drama, The Sword of Kentucky, is based on what historical character? General George Rogers Clark. What Kentuckian was full-time assistant on President Nixon's memoirs? What Kentuckian was a full-time assistant on President Nixon's memoirs? Diane Sawyer. What 1980 autobiography was about country music star Loretta Lynn? What 1980 autobiography was about country music star Loretta Lynn? Coal Miner's Daughter. What East Kentucky Creek's name is a corruption of a place name from Gulliver's Travels? What East Kentucky Creek's name is a corruption of the place name from Gulliver's Travels? And it was named by Daniel Boone. The creek's name is Lawbygrud Creek, and it's from Lore Brogrud. So Lawbygrud Creek is a corruption of a place name from Gulliver's Travels, named by Daniel Boone. What was the first newspaper to be published in Kentucky? And where? What was the first newspaper to be published in Kentucky? And where? The Kentucky Gazette. It was out of Lexington. Who helped establish the Kentucky Herald, the state's second newspaper in Lexington in 1793? James H. Stewart. Jan Arnow, who served as the executive director of the Art Center in Louisville, produced what 1984 nonfiction work? Jan Arnow. The Louisville Slugger, The Making of a Baseball Bat.